There are moments in life, a story so deeply rooted in faith, culture, and the ultimate mystery that all of us must one day face. This story began with a simple description of what happens when a Muslim passes away. In Islam, death is not seen as an abrupt end, but as a continuation of the soul's journey. From the first breath a human takes, their life is viewed as a trust, a gift, and their death as the moment when that trust is returned to its creator. This perspective strips away much of the fear that modern society has attached to the subject of death. Instead of something to dread, it becomes something to prepare for, to meet with dignity and clarity. But what shook Joe to his core wasn't just the theology. It was the human element, the intimacy, and the sheer beauty of how this faith frames the final goodbye. Imagine this: the moment a Muslim dies, their loved ones gather. The body is washed with water, gently and carefully, as if cradling the person one last time. Close family and friends participate in this ritual, not professionals, not strangers, but those who knew the person in life. They clean the body, wrap it in a simple white shroud, and pray over it. There are no suits, no flashy coffins, no commercialized displays. Just simplicity, humility, and love. Joe listened as this process was described. His usual tough exterior, the MMA commentator who had watched blood and sweat cover the octagon, was suddenly fragile. The thought of people gently preparing their loved ones for their final journey, with their own hands, without fear or hesitation, was overwhelming. For him, it was a stark contrast to how death is often treated in the West: hidden, sanitized, avoided. But what struck even deeper was the perspective on what comes next. Islam teaches that death is not annihilation, it's transition. The body may rest in the ground, but the soul continues. There is an immediate encounter with what Muslims believe to be angels who question the deceased in their grave. It is a profound and sobering teaching, reminding every believer that what they did in life echoes into eternity. Every action, every word, every intention is accounted for. As the story unfolded, Joe's voice wavered. He had heard about life after death in various religious traditions, but the way Islam painted this picture was different. It wasn't abstract philosophy. It wasn't detached speculation. It was vivid, detailed, and personal. The way Muslims prepare for death isn't just through rituals when it happens. It's by living every single day with the awareness that death can come at any moment. For Joe, who had spent countless hours speaking about discipline, about martial arts, about honing the mind and body, this idea resonated in a way he couldn't deny. The discipline of living with death in mind, not in fear but in readiness, seemed like the ultimate form of mindfulness. Imagine living each day knowing it could be your last, but instead of despair, it gives you clarity. That was the message embedded in the story, and it pierced through the casual banter of the studio like a blade. And then came the part that broke him, the story of a young Muslim child who had passed away. The father, heartbroken, still gathered the strength to whisper words of prayer, to remind himself that his child's soul was not lost, not gone into nothingness, but simply returned to the one who created it. The family, even in their grief, found solace in the belief that this separation was temporary, that reunion awaited in the next life. Hearing that, Joe could no longer contain the flood of emotions. The idea of losing a child is one of the most devastating realities any parent could imagine, and yet here was a faith tradition that offered such profound comfort, such unshakable hope, that it could transform unbearable grief into patient endurance. Tears welled up in his eyes, and for a moment the room was silent. It wasn't just the story of death. It was the story of meaning, of how faith can provide answers when logic falls short. For a man who often prided himself on questioning everything, Joe realized that there are some moments when the answer is not in questioning, but in surrendering to something greater than ourselves. As the chapter closed, the audience watching could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just another podcast clip. This wasn't a funny debate or a wild conspiracy. This was the raw human heart confronting the greatest mystery of existence. Joe Rogan, the man who had seen it all, who had listened to everyone, was moved to tears by the simple yet profound beauty of Islam's view of death. And yet, this was only the beginning. Because once that door was opened, once the idea of death as a transition and not an end was placed on the table, the questions that followed were even more powerful. The silence that followed Joe's tears was unlike anything his audience had ever seen. This was a man who had hosted thousands of hours of conversation, someone who thrived on energy, laughter, and intense debate. Yet here, in the wake of hearing about the Islamic perspective on death, there was only stillness. The weight of the topic pressed on him, and instead of filling the silence with words, he let it breathe. That pause spoke louder than any argument could. When the conversation began again, it was no longer just about rituals or cultural practices. It turned inward into the very core of what it means to be alive. Joe had always been fascinated by consciousness, what it is, where it comes from, and whether it continues after death. He had spoken with neuroscientists about the brain, monks about enlightenment, and physicists about the possibility of multiverses. But what struck him now was how Islam's teachings cut through the abstract theories and spoke directly to the heart of human experience. In Islam, the soul is not an illusion, not just an emergent property of brain activity. It is the very essence of who we are, breathed into us by God Himself. Life is seen as a test, a temporary station where every choice carries eternal weight. And when death arrives, it does not erase who we are. It reveals the truth of who we became. This idea hit Joe like a wave. The thought that death wasn't the end, but a mirror held up to the soul, was terrifying and comforting all at once. Terrifying because it meant accountability, comforting because it meant existence had purpose. Imagine going through life with the understanding that nothing is wasted, not your pain, not your joy, not your struggles. Every tear, every smile, every hardship counts. It all echoes into forever. The story continued with descriptions of the afterlife as Islam teaches it. For the righteous, death is the doorway to peace. Their graves expand with light, their souls are greeted with mercy, and they are shown glimpses of the paradise awaiting them. But for those who lived in arrogance, cruelty, or heedlessness, the transition is very different. Their graves constrict, their souls taste regret, and they begin to realize that their neglect of truth has consequences. For Joe, who had spent so much of his career emphasizing personal responsibility, discipline, and facing reality head-on, this framework resonated deeply. Here was a religion that didn't shy away from accountability. It wasn't about blind faith or cheap forgiveness. It was about living with intention, about recognizing that the way you treat people, the way you use your time, the way you live, it all matters. And yet, beyond the fear, there was a beauty to it. The description of paradise wasn't just symbolic poetry. It was detailed, rich, and profoundly human. Gardens beneath which rivers flow, reunions with loved ones, peace beyond imagination. For someone like Joe, who often explored altered states of consciousness and the idea of transcendent experiences, the thought of a perfected existence resonated with the deepest human longing. But then came the part that broke him again. The story of how Muslims view their dead not as lost, not as erased from history, but as people who simply changed worlds. Families visit the graves, not in despair, but in prayer. They make supplications, asking God to grant their loved ones peace, forgiveness, and light. They speak to their Creator on behalf of their parents, their children, their spouses, believing with absolute certainty that their words can reach beyond the veil of death. Joe imagined standing at the grave of someone he loved, not empty-handed, not broken, but with the ability to offer them something even after they were gone. That idea shook him. In a culture where death is often final, cold, and silent, here was a tradition that made the living and the dead feel connected, united by faith and remembrance. And then the most profound truth emerged. In Islam, death is the great equalizer. No matter how rich, how powerful, how famous a person may be, when they die, they are wrapped in the same simple white shroud. Presidents, beggars, athletes, scholars all are buried in the earth the same way. No jewels, no crowns, no wealth. Just the soul, standing before God with nothing but their deeds. Joe had always been someone who questioned the obsession with fame, money, and status. He had spoken about how empty materialism can feel, how even the richest celebrities often struggle with meaning. Hearing about the Islamic approach to death, where everything is stripped away except who you truly are, brought clarity to that critique. It was the ultimate reminder: you cannot take anything with you except the kind of person you became. The tears Joe shed were not only for the beauty of the rituals or the comfort of the afterlife. They were for the realization of how fragile and precious life truly is. Every argument, every grudge, every wasted day suddenly seemed unbearable in the shadow of eternity. What mattered were the moments of kindness, the pursuit of truth, the relationships built on love and sincerity. But there was still more to come. The conversation turned to the idea of martyrdom, of dying in faith, of meeting death with courage and conviction. Islam does not glorify death itself, but it honors those who face it with patience, dignity, and trust in God. Joe, who had always admired warriors, fighters, and those who confronted fear head-on, saw in this teaching a reflection of the ultimate warrior's mindset: to meet the greatest unknown with strength and surrender at once. As the studio lights flickered and the cameras captured every tremor in his voice, the moment transformed from just a podcast to something bigger. This was a man confronting his mortality in front of millions of viewers. This was not entertainment, it was revelation. The weight of the discussion lingered, and Joe knew that the audience, scattered across the globe, was feeling it too. Death was no longer an abstract idea. It was a mirror being held up to everyone listening. The Islamic perspective had cut through the noise and delivered a raw, undeniable truth: that life is short, death is certain, and what comes next depends on how you lived. And yet the conversation was not finished, because if death is inevitable, if the afterlife is real, then the question remains: how does one prepare? What does it mean to live a life that is ready for that moment when the soul is taken? The heaviness of the room was undeniable. Joe had faced the truth of death. He had seen the vision of the afterlife through the lens of Islam, and now the question that remained was piercing. How should one live knowing that death could arrive at any moment? The answer, as the story unfolded, was not complicated. It was not about seeking perfection, nor was it about living without mistakes. It was about intention. It was about walking through life with a heart that remembers its purpose. In Islam, every act, no matter how small, can carry eternal weight if it is done with sincerity. Eating, working, raising children, even smiling at a stranger, all of these become threads woven into the fabric of one's final judgment. This struck Joe with incredible force. He had always admired discipline, the ability to stick to routines, to sharpen the body and mind through martial arts, diet, and relentless practice. But here, discipline was not just about self-mastery, it was about God, consciousness. It was about remembering that every step, every breath, could either bring you closer to mercy or further into heedlessness. For the first time, Joe realized that preparing for death in Islam is not a grim obsession. It is a way to live fully. It is a way to cherish time, to treat every moment as an opportunity to add meaning, to add value. When you know that death is certain, every sunrise becomes more beautiful, every laugh more precious, every act of kindness more urgent. The story expanded into the practices that Muslims adopt to keep this awareness alive. The 5 daily prayers pauses in the rush of life to bow, to submit, to remember. The giving of charity not just as generosity, but as a way to cleanse wealth, to purify the soul. Fasting not simply hunger, but training the body to resist desires, to sharpen gratitude. Each of these practices, when seen through the lens of preparing for death, transformed into more than rituals. They became tools for living a life ready to face eternity. Joe's mind wandered to the countless hours he had spent in the gym, the octagon, and the podcast studio. He had always sought intensity, always chased the rawest parts of human experience. Yet here was a faith that demanded intensity of a different kind, the intensity of humility, of gratitude, of surrender. Not weakness, not passivity, but the courage to live with the constant awareness that the end is near. And then came the reminder of accountability. Islam teaches that on the day of judgment, every person will stand before their Creator. Their deeds will be laid bare, nothing will be hidden. The smallest act of kindness, the quietest thought of cruelty, the moments no one else saw, all of it will be present. For some, this will be a day of unimaginable joy, when the struggles of this world finally make sense. For others, it will be a day of regret. Joe thought about his own life, the choices he had made, the people he had influenced, the millions of listeners who tuned in to his words. What if every single one of those moments carried weight beyond this world? What if every careless word, every good deed, every decision was etched into eternity? The realization was overwhelming, but it was also clarifying. It meant life was not meaningless. It meant every second mattered. The conversation turned to forgiveness. Islam teaches that no matter how heavy the sins, God's mercy is greater. A person could spend a lifetime lost, and yet if they turned sincerely before death, they could be forgiven. The doors of repentance never close until the soul is taken. For Joe, this was perhaps the most moving part. The idea that even at the very end, even after mistakes and failures, hope remained. The tears returned to his eyes as he thought of people he had known, friends, family, even strangers, who carried pain, regret, and guilt. What if they too had a chance at redemption? And then came the most profound reminder of all. No one knows when their death will come. The young are not guaranteed old age, the healthy are not guaranteed tomorrow. Death does not wait for the right moment, it arrives when it is written. For Muslims, this uncertainty is not a curse. It is a call to live every day as if it were the last. To never delay an apology, to never withhold kindness, to never postpone doing what matters. Joe's voice cracked as he absorbed this. He had spent countless hours urging his listeners to do hard things, to seize the day, to live with courage. Yet here was the ultimate version of that philosophy. Live every moment as though your next breath could be your last. Not recklessly, not selfishly, but with awareness, gratitude, and faith. The speech reached its emotional peak with one final image, the moment of death itself. In Islam, it is said that for the believer, death comes gently, Angels arrive radiating peace, calling the soul to come out to the mercy of God. The body may weaken, but the soul is carried with dignity. For those unprepared, however, the moment is filled with struggle, regret, and fear. The contrast could not be clearer. Two people, two deaths, two destinies shaped entirely by how they lived. At this point, Joe could no longer hold back. His tears were not just for the stories he had heard, but for the recognition of his own mortality. He was not invincible, not immune, not separate from this truth. One day, he too would take his final breath. One day, his voice would fall silent, his laughter would fade, and his body would return to the earth. What would remain? What legacy would he leave? What would his soul face on the other side? The studio had never felt so raw, so stripped of performance. The audience watching could feel it too. This was no longer a podcast clip, no longer entertainment. This was the universal truth, spoken through tears, echoing into millions of hearts. And then, with quiet strength, the final words emerged. Death is not the end. Death is a doorway. For those who prepare, it is a reunion with mercy, with peace, with eternity. For those who ignore it, it is regret too late to undo. The choice is ours, and the time is now. Joe sat back, wiping his face, his heart heavier and yet strangely lighter. He had been confronted with the hardest truth, and instead of despair, he had found clarity. Death was not something to fear. It was something to prepare for. And in that preparation, life itself became infinitely more precious. The story ended there, but its echo lingered far beyond the studio. In the hearts of millions, in the quiet of their own reflections, people began to ask themselves the same question. If death could come at any moment, how should I live today?